This meeting on Belimumab and Voclosporin for Nephritis. We're going to be starting in 1 minute, and then I'll hand it over to the chair of the New England CEPAC.
Hi, good morning. My name is Dr. Jason Wassi. I'm a cardiologist at Mass General Hospital. I lead our program in health outcomes research in cardiology. I want to welcome everyone to this CEPAC meeting, and would just remind all participants to have your camera on and unmute microphone while speaking. So at the beginning of every CEPAC meeting, we want to ensure that all speakers disclose any financial relationships with industry. To that end, every member of our CEPAC panel here today has met the ICER conflict of interest policy. Would each CEPAC member introduce themselves, tell us a bit about your work, and note whether you have any updates to this declaration? And just given the Zoom context, what I'll do is I'll just read names in alphabetical order. So I guess I would just start by Dr. Rob Azeltine.
Good morning, my name is Rob Azeltine, professor and chair of the Division of Behavioral Sciences and Community Health at the University of Connecticut Health Center. I'm a mental health researcher, and I have no updates to my conflicts.
Thank you. Kelly Buckland.
Sorry, having trouble getting off mute. I'm Kelly Buckland. I'm the director of the National Council on Independent Living. We are a membership organization for Centers for Independent Living and statewide independent living councils. And I don't have any conflicts to report.
Thank you so much. Dr. Rena Conti.
Everyone, my name is Rena Conti. I'm a health economist and expert in the pricing, supply, and demand of prescription drugs. I am currently associate professor in the Questrom School of Business at Boston University, and I'm also associate director of the Pharmaceutical Policy Group at the Institute for Healthcare System Change and Policy also at Boston University. I have no updates to my conflict of interest. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Martha Gold.
Good morning. I'm Martha Gold. I'm a clinician, a physician by training. I'm a senior scholar at the New York Academy of Medicine and professor emerita at the City University of New York Medical School. My work has been in priority setting and getting public input into how participants feel about setting priorities for important decisions. Thank you, and I have no conflicts of interest.
Thank you so much. Megan Golden.
Hi, I'm Megan Golden. I'm the co-founder and CEO of the nonprofit Mission Cure. We're a patient advocacy organization dedicated to developing effective therapies for pancreatitis, and I have no additional conflicts.
Thank you so much. Rebecca Kirsch.
Good morning, I'm Rebecca Kirsch with the National Patient Advocate Foundation, and we support patients and caregivers with all types of complex and chronic illness. I'm the Executive Vice President of Policy and Programs. No conflicts to disclose.
Thank you so much. Dr. Steve Kogan.
Morning all. I'm Steve Kogut. I'm a professor specializing in health outcomes research at the College of Pharmacy at the University of Rhode Island. I'm also the director of tracking and evaluation for Advanced CTR, which is Rhode Island's clinical and translational research program funded by the National Institute for General Medical Sciences.
Thank you so much. Dr. Greg Lowe.
Oh, I'm sorry, and I have no conflicts to update.
Thank you, and thank you for reminding me to ask you to do that. Dr. Greg Lowe.
Great, good morning. My name is Greg Lowe. I'm a pharmacist and pharmacoepidemiologist. I'm the program director for the Mass General Physicians Organization's quality program, quality and utilization program, and no updates to my conflicts. Thanks.
Thank you. Dr. Eleftherios Milonakis.
Good morning. My name is Eleftherios Milonakis. I'm professor of medicine, molecular microbiology and immunology, assistant dean and chief of infectious diseases at Brown University. The vast majority of the outside funding for my research works comes from NIH. As part of the COVID-19 clinical work, we have been involved in a number of clinical trials. Any funding associated with those clinical trials that comes from BARDA, NIH, or other sources goes directly to my institution. Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Stephanie Nichols.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephanie Nichols. I'm an associate professor at the University of New England School of Pharmacy. I'm a psychiatry and substance use disorder pharmacist by training, and I'm also an adjunct assistant clinical professor of psychiatry with the Tufts School of Medicine, and I have no updates to my conflicts.
Thank you so much. Dr. Jean Ryer.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Jean Ryer. I am the director of the New Hampshire Citizens Health Initiative, which is a multi-stakeholder convener and a regional quality improvement collaborative. I'm also leading the work on delivery system and payment reform for the Institute for Health Policy and Practice at the University of New Hampshire, and I have no updates to my conflict of interest.
Thank you. Dr. Jason Schwartz.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Jason Schwartz. I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Health Policy and Management at the Yale School of Public Health. My work looks at medical products, regulation, policy, and policy making, and no updates to my conflicts.
Thank you so much. And I think, so I'm the only one left. I too have no updates to my conflicts. So next, we also, obviously all CEPAC meetings involve heavy input from individual patient and clinical experts. So we have a few that I'd ask to introduce themselves and also declare any potential conflicts of interest. So I would start by asking Dr. Kathleen Arnston.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to participate. I am the volunteer president and CEO of Lupus and Allied Diseases Association and a person with lupus and kidney disease. LADA is an all-volunteer and patient-led national organization that does receive program funding from healthcare-related organizations, including Aurinia and GSK. However, LADA representatives are not compensated. In addition, LADA does not solicit or receive any funding specific to value assessments.
Thank you so much. Christelle Felix.
Good morning. I'm Christelle Felix. I'm a patient and advocate. I represent Lupus and the lupus community, and I have no conflicts of interest.
Thank you so much. Dr. Megan Mackey.
Good morning, I'm Megan Mackey. I'm a physician, professor of medicine, and investigator at the Feinstein Institutes at Northwell. I'm a rheumatologist, and I devote at least probably 50–60% of time to clinical research. So I am involved in clinical trials that are funded by pharmaceuticals, and I have investigator-initiated research funded by the National Institutes of Health.
Thank you, Dr. Mackey. Dr. Brad Rovin.
Sorry, I was muted. Good morning, everybody. Brad Roven. I'm the Chief of Nephrology at Ohio State University Wexner Medical Center. I have a research interest in autoimmune kidney diseases and study lupus and lupus nephritis in my laboratory. Like Megan, I do clinical trials, and I have participated in both of the pivotal clinical trials regarding the drugs that we're discussing today. And I've also been a scientific advisor for GSK as well as Aurinia.
Thank you so much. We're delighted to have all of you here to share your experience and your expertise. I would also request that throughout the duration of today's session, that any other speakers, including participants in the policy roundtable and individuals making public comments, should announce any financial relationships with industry or any other potential influences on judgment when they speak, similar to what you've heard this morning already. We will also present this information publicly on slides. So with that, I'm very happy to introduce Dr. Steve Pearson, who is a primary care doctor and the president of ICER.
Thank you, Jason, and good morning to the New England CEPAC. Thank you very much to our patient experts and clinical experts who will be joining us throughout the day. Let me start with just a brief introduction and kind of setting the frame for today's meeting. Why are we here today? Let me start with a quote from a patient that we received. People should know that lupus is never the same for everyone. Lupus is insidious, its thievery is endless. The effects to my daily life are profound from lupus. I no longer teach. I no longer have the physical ability to do the things that I used to. I have lists to remember things and multiple calendars. If I overdo it one day, I pay for it for 3. I've learned to do things in pieces. Pacing is key. And what you hear, I think, in this quote, and in which I know you'll hear from the comments from patient experts today, is that lupus really affects every single facet of a person's life, and that in many ways of their family. And the unmet need is tremendous. So we're very fortunate to be here today to be addressing what we will do with 2 new effective treatments that have been approved by the FDA for lupus nephritis. And the day that these treatments are, and this is in general, not just the 2 we're talking about today, but the day that these treatments are approved, what happens, as I mentioned, is a sense of celebration that there are new options for patients, new hope for them to get better. It's also a sense of celebration because of the dedication of patients and others over years of clinical trials, over the investments, the risks that are taken in the development of drugs. So it's a culmination of a lot of factors that, in a sense, hit that point on the day when the FDA says, yes, it's approved. What also happens, though, is that from that day one, the drug is now available to clinicians and patients around the country, and questions start to be raised around who can get it and how much will it cost? Because from day one, we don't wait to find out more about the treatments, which we always want to do in some sense, and we will learn more about them. But from day one, decisions will be made about how they'll be used and what they will cost and who will get a chance to price it, etc. So as all that starts to happen, patients often do worry about whether they can have access or will get access to these drugs. And they worry about their coverage, they worry about their costs. And so a lot of what we'll talk about today will be focused on patients with lupus nephritis and how these treatments, the evidence stacks up and what we can learn from them, the questions that still remain. But we'll also, in a sense, want to remember that one of the reasons we're here today is because even though we'll be focusing on the treatment and the patient condition, in a sense, before us, things are happening to other patients throughout the healthcare system as we introduce new treatments, and especially their costs. And to a certain extent, we all are familiar with the idea that healthcare costs are rising faster than wages and faster than the overall economy in the United States. And that creates real tension. Because when there isn't enough money for health insurance, people get hurt. The first gentleman on the left here is actually a pharmacist himself, but he also is a pastor. And he has been very outspoken about the effects that he sees in the Black community of the effects of the high prices of drugs. So he's out there trying to bring attention. This is Dr. Leonard Edlow. He's trying to bring attention to the fact that almost unseen are many patients who are hurt as healthcare costs go up. Similarly, these other folks that you see in the pictures were in a national article about families and others who are struggling with the cost of health insurance. The Whitmans, who live in Alaska, have 2 young children, and they're not poor, if you will, by federal standards, but they fall into that gap where there aren't enough subsidies to join the state health exchange where they live. And so they have felt that they can only financially make it if they do without health insurance. And this has meant that their kids have had to miss appointments, not get checkups, and actually not go to the emergency room on a couple of occasions when they were hurt. And the parents in the article expressed their distress that they were maybe hurting their children's long-term health through not having health insurance. The last gentleman to the right is a small employer himself. And in the article, he goes through the travails that he's seen his employees have, and he has struggled to try to provide health insurance for them, but has had to drop it. As an employer, he can no longer afford to provide it for them. So his employees are now going without insurance. They're leaving his company to try to find insurance. So we just have to be I think we have to recognize that in a sense, we have to have a broad scope when we're thinking about why we're here today. A lot of it will obviously be about lupus nephritis, but part of why we're here today is to wrestle with the challenge of making sure that as we introduce new treatments into clinical care and as we start to pay for them, that we do so in a way that can create a balance and not hurt other people more than the gains that we'll get from treating the patients in a sense before us. And doctors and others are familiar with this sense that we are focused and wanting to do our all for the patient and the family in front of us. And forgive me for the stereotypical icons here that show one form of family, but we also know that around the patient we can see before us, there are other families, other people who come in many different walks of life, different colors, shapes, sizes, etc. And they're all part of a community in which we want to make sure that our health system is balanced to welcome innovation, to reward it in proportion so that we can have the resources to care for everybody. So that's why we're here today, largely. And you've heard the introduction of the members of the New England CEPAC, our Independent Advisory Appraisal Committee. I need to tell you a bit about ICER, which is, in a sense, the convening host of this meeting and serves as the academic secretariat to produce the report. So first, our funding, this is our entire revenue pie, if you will, for 2021, and you'll see that the biggest piece of this pie is from nonprofit foundations, none of which are directly connected to either the health insurance or the life science industries. The largest one within that set is the Laura and John Arnold Foundation. There are other foundations in there as well. We do take approximately 20% overall from a mix of direct contributions from drug makers and from health plans and provider groups. That goes to a separate policy summit process that we run for them and does not feed into the reports or the meetings that we host. We also have about 10% of our funding from government, grants and contracts, and a very small amount of individual donations. So the report today that's the substrate of the public discussion we'll have was developed over approximately 8 months. And it starts with a scoping phase, as we call it, in which we reach out to the patient experts, groups and clinical experts, and we really say, orient us, help us learn what it is to live with this condition. What are the challenges? What does value mean to you? What do we look for in the clinical evidence? What's missing and what can we maybe complement from other sources? We get all of that guidance at the beginning before we start. And then we dive into our analysis of the evidence that we can find, that we can create in collaboration with patients and others. And we also work with outside academics often to do the cost effectiveness modeling that's a core part of our reports and the discussion today. And in this case, we worked with academics at the University of Sheffield in England. The report goes through several different phases of public comment and revision. And as part of that, we were fortunate to have specific reviews from Kathleen Arnston, who's been introduced already, and from Dr. Michael Ward, who is the Chief of Clinical Trials and Outcomes branch at the NIA, I'm not even sure how they use the acronym there. I'll just say it, the National Institute of Arthritis and Musculoskeletal and Skin Diseases. So briefly, how's the evidence in the report structured to support our discussion around value today? So first, a lot of our discussion is focused on what we call long-term value for money, and that's one of the key votes that we take at the end of the day. So what is long-term value for money? It is comprised of multiple different components, and you'll hear about each of these throughout the course of the day, and they're all discussed separately to some extent in the report. We're going to talk about the way that new treatments can give us health benefits at the bottom of this kind of lineup, if you will, by helping us live longer lives. Some treatments don't help us live longer lives, but they do important good for us by helping us return to greater function, or by providing fewer side effects and other treatment options. They improve our quality of life. We want to look at the total costs overall of new treatments and how they affect the cost of care. And that's not just drug costs, but how might they affect care way downstream? Maybe they prevent hospital visits or other doctor visits or other kinds of treatment costs. So we want to make sure that we take a very broad view of the cost when we're talking about value. What's in the blue there are important because there are things that matter to patients and families and to society that in some ways are beyond a strict definition of health. We'll talk about these contextual issues, the potential other benefits as they come through our report and in the votes, but these are going to be an important part of our discussion today. And linked to those in some way, or whether there are kind of contextual or broad social and ethical priorities that we want to think about in the way that we look at conditions overall and in the way that we might look at specific treatments for patients with conditions. So we'll be discussing these, and it's part of why it's really important to have public meetings and not just assume that this all gets made up in some kind of mathematical formula off stage. It really benefits and requires the input, the transparency, and the honesty of all participants in our healthcare system. So they'll be here today to help us have that conversation. I'm going to give you just a really brief idea of how this kind of leads through to our thinking about pricing. So, and actually, given the course of the day and the cost, the time, I'm going to try to be very brief with this and skip forward. So basically, this just shows that if the middle dot there is where we currently have our current best care for patients with lupus nephritis, and that has a certain effectiveness, versus doing nothing, and it has a certain cost. We're going to be talking today about adding new things, adding new treatments. And they might have, for instance, hypothetically, more effectiveness. They might improve patients' health and other outcomes, and they might have higher costs. Some drugs will have a little bit more health and a much higher cost. And so basically what cost effectiveness is, as a part of our discussion today, it's a way to say, how do we know when we're getting enough clinical benefit for the extra costs we're being asked to contribute? And that makes us talk about cost effectiveness thresholds or ranges. And the idea of setting a range here is to say that we want to find a price. And if this is the current price for this treatment, we might say that it would be a reasonable value if the price dropped so that it fell into that zone. And the zone is important really just because only when treatments are introduced and priced in that zone can we have confidence that we're doing more good than harm. That concern about the Whitman family and about Luke Breen and his employees, or the people that Leonard Edlow works with, that we have to make sure that we are accelerating the costs of care throughout the healthcare system in a sustainable way that allows them to afford health insurance overall, and that can make sure that when we pay for new treatments that bring benefits to patients, we do so in a way that helps everybody. So we put all these together by talking today about the cost effectiveness. We'll talk about this threshold price at which we can create more health than harm. And then these other features that I talked about, the benefits beyond health, and the special priorities. We'll talk about those as important factors to think about how decision makers should really think about kind of fair pricing and what society wants to think about how we approach this kind of consideration. And we'll want to think about the cost effectiveness in a sense as setting some goalposts, and some of these other factors are important to consider in how we move between them or beyond them in some cases to make sure that we recognize the full value of treatments. And we actually at ICER, we tilt our considerations towards pricing generally between 100,000 per quality or equal value of life year gained and 150,000. Other people will choose other thresholds, but that's just a kind of a conceptual backdrop to a lot of the discussion that we'll be having today. So here's the agenda. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Jeff Tice in a second, who will lead us through a summary of the clinical effectiveness information. Then the economic model results will be discussed and commented upon through a series of public comments and discussion. Then after a lunch, we will come back for the deliberation and vote on comparative clinical effectiveness, potential other benefits and value. And we'll conclude with a policy roundtable, an important part of the day where our patient experts, our clinical experts will still be with us, and they'll be joined by manufacturers and by representatives from the insurance industry to talk about the nuts and bolts of what's going to happen next. And what can we learn from the past to do it right as we introduce new treatments, these two in particular? What can we learn about how to do the pricing, how to do the coverage, how to help clinicians and patients learn what they need to know about these treatments, and how also to kind of set the stage for future research that will fill in the gaps that everybody needs to know more about. So we'll have some final reflections and we'll close the day by 3:30 Eastern. And with that, let me thank Dr. Tice for being with us today and ask him again to introduce himself, and he will take the presentation from here.
Thanks, Steve, and good morning, everyone. I'm Jeff Tice. I'm a general internist, primary care physician at the University of California in San Francisco. Next slide, please. I want to acknowledge my collaborators on the clinical evidence team, Serena Heron-Smith and Belen Herzhagawara. They did the heavy lifting in sorting through the literature, and none of us have any conflicts of interest to report. Next slide, please. So we're talking about lupus nephritis today. Lupus itself affects between 300,000 and 1.5 million people in the United States. It's a strong predominance of women, so 90% of patients with lupus are female. And about half of patients with lupus will develop lupus nephritis during their lifetime. And this is important because it is the most common cause of death and disability in lupus. And it affects people in the prime of life between the ages of 20 and 40. These are, of course, since most of the affected patients are female, these are childbearing years. It's characterized by protein in the urine initially, so proteinuria. The standard has been to get 24-hour urine collections and quantify the protein that way, but that's burdensome. And so most commonly, we actually use just a ratio of the protein in the urine to the creatinine in the urine. That's the UC-PCR, which you'll see that's the primary outcome in many of the trials. And we want to reduce proteinuria. And over time, the proteinuria is an early sign, but this is followed by a loss of kidney function. This is measured by the filtration rate in the kidney, the GFR. It's estimated using certain equations, and that's also an important thing when talking about treatment of lupus nephritis. We want to avoid the loss of kidney function. And then finally, for context, Blacks and Hispanics have a much more severe and progressive lupus nephritis compared to people of European ancestry. So some real disparities. And in fact, Blacks in particular don't respond as well to standard therapy. So a lot of unmet need in the Black population. Next slide, please. So the primary impact on patients is, of course, the progressive loss of kidney function leading to end-stage renal disease. This means that the patient requires either dialysis or a kidney transplant to avoid death. But when we talk to patients, we hear about lots of other things that matter to them. The side effects of the current treatments are burdensome steroids, corticosteroids, as we know, short-term affects blood sugar, blood pressure, and how people feel can provoke significant psychiatric illness, and then many long-term complications of corticosteroids. So reducing corticosteroid use is an important outcome here. And then the other immunosuppressive therapies put patients at risk for cancers, at risk for infections, serious infections. And so patients are really concerned about that. And for patients with lupus alone or with lupus nephritis, one of the day-to-day things, I think we heard this from the initial quote that Steve opened the meeting with, fatigue, just the impact of fatigue on their ability to do anything. So an essential outcome, and if we can make an impact there, that would be great. And then the cost of treatment, issues around childbearing, both because of the kidney disease, but also because of the potential for birth defects caused by some of the therapies that we use for treating lupus nephritis. And finally, it affects patients' ability to either complete schooling or advance their careers. Next slide, please. So the standard of care currently has been initial induction therapy, so very high dose corticosteroids, plus one of two immunosuppressive drugs, mycophenolate mofetil, which it's a mouthful, so we'll abbreviate it as MMF, or cyclophosphamide. And once things are initially under control, we usually lower the dose, try and lower the dose of corticosteroids to the lowest possible. And typically we maintain people on MMF because it's an oral drug and generally well tolerated, but at lower doses than induction therapy. However, less than half of patients achieve a sustained remission in their lupus nephritis with current therapies, so a large unmet need. And currently about 11% of patients progress to end-stage renal disease at 5 years and 17% at 10 years. This is a big improvement compared to 10 or 15 years ago, but still way too many people progressing to end-stage renal disease. Next slide, please. So the new therapies, first one is Belimumab. It's a B lymphocyte stimulator inhibitor. Given the dosing here, was initially approved for the treatment of lupus back in 2011, but in December of last year, based on the BLISS-LN trial that we'll describe, the indication was expanded to include lupus nephritis. Next slide, please. And then the second therapy is Voclosporin. It's a calcineurin inhibitor. There are a number of others on the market. This one has a more stable dosing and is thought to be less toxic. And it was just approved in January of this year. Next slide, please. So the outcomes, there are many more outcomes than I'm listing here, but the primary outcome for Belimumab is called the primary efficacy renal response, something unique to the clinical trial here. And it looks at this outcome at 2 years. It looks at the protein excretion, the UPCR, and you want a low protein excretion and a maintained renal function as measured by the GFR. The outcome is more complicated than this. It includes a certain percentage reduction in GFR that's allowable and no failure of treatment and low steroid use. So it's a very complicated outcome that's described in detail in the full report, but these are the key elements. And secondary outcome is a complete renal response, which is more akin to the primary outcome in the Voclosporin trial. So that's why I put it here. And here was a little more stringent criteria for protein excretion and the GFR. Unfortunately, there may be measures in the trial, but there are no reported results on fatigue or quality of life in the Belimumab trial. Next slide, please. For voclosporin, we see the primary outcome is more like that complete renal response, the secondary outcome in the Belimumab trial, and the secondary key secondary outcome was a partial response, where there was at least a 50% reduction in the protein excretion in the urine. Again, no results have been reported on fatigue or other measures of quality of life. Next slide, please. So as Steve mentioned, we start by talking to patients and hear what aspects of lupus nephritis are important to them. And they insisted that we highlight the white, non-white disparities for patients with lupus nephritis. And one example is that Black patients progress to end-stage renal disease at almost 9 times the rate of white patients. They also wanted us to highlight the uniqueness of each patient. There is no model patient or some patient that represents all patients. Everyone has a unique comorbidities, unique demographics, unique living circumstances, and they're on different baseline medications. So just to keep that in mind, that there needs to be personalization to the unique situation of each individual patient. And then, given the young age of onset of lupus nephritis, the disease has a huge impact, a negative impact on patients' ability to work, to have children, and to advance in their careers. And finally, we heard this year, of course, the impact of COVID. Some therapies require intravenous infusions, and thus you need to travel to a medical center where there are potentially other patients who are sick with COVID. So above and beyond the usual burdens of infusion therapy, the concerns about COVID were particularly important this year. Next slide, please. So with that, I will turn to the clinical evidence. Next slide, please. For Belimumab, there's one key trial, the BLISS-LN trial. It's the pivotal phase 3 randomized trial. There were 448 patients. Mean age was 33, so young, and 88% female, so very representative of patients with lupus nephritis. About half were Asian, reflecting some of the clinical trial sites, a third white and 14% Black. For Voclosporin, the combined baseline characteristics for the 2 trials, the AURORA-LV was a dose finding phase 2 trial, and the AURORA trial is the phase 3 pivotal trial. There were a total of 534 patients. Again, very similar characteristics. Age 33 was the average, 87% female. Here are a few less Asians, but very similar to the pivotal trial for Belimumab. The one thing I want to highlight here is that this is not really representative of the US population. In the US, a higher proportion of patients are Black. Next slide, please. So these are the primary outcomes in the trial. I shouldn't say that it's not the primary outcome for Belimumab, but was sort of comparable, though not identical outcomes. The complete renal response for Belimumab at 1 year was approximately 32% versus 25% for the placebo group. So a clear benefit, and that was preserved at 2 years, 30% and 20%. In the placebo group, so about a 10% absolute difference. So a big improvement in complete response, going from 20% to 30%, but certainly not reaching the majority of patients. So the Belimumab trial was a 2-year trial. The pivotal trials for Voclosporin had 1-year outcomes, and the complete response was 42% in the active treatment group and 23% in the placebo group. Next slide, please. There were many harms looked at, but really everything, and nothing stood out as being an issue for either of the drugs. So significant adverse events, 21% in both groups in the Voclosporin trial, 26% in the Belimumab group, 30% in the placebo group. So a trend towards fewer significant adverse events. Discontinuations due to adverse events were more common in the placebo group than the active treatment group for the Voclosporin trial, and were identical in the Belimumab trial. Mortality, again, a little bit lower in the Voclosporin active treatment arm compared to placebo, a little bit higher, but not significantly different between Belimumab and placebo. And finally, serious infections, which we worry about with these immunosuppressive therapies, were actually lower in the active treatment arms of both Voclosporin and Belimumab. One thing that came up in public comments was the need to highlight that Voclosporin does carry a black box warning for serious infections and malignancies. This reflects sort of the class of drugs that Voclosporin falls into, the calcineurin inhibitors, but as you can see here, there wasn't an excess in the clinical trial data to date. Next slide, please. So there are a number of controversies and uncertainties. The 1- and 2-year renal response outcomes, we really don't know how that's going to translate into progressive renal disease leading to end-stage renal disease, dialysis, and death, which is really what we care about from at least the perspective of the kidney. So a lot of uncertainty. People who go into complete remission do have relapses. There's uncertainty about how long to continue the therapies, when to say, it's not working, switch to something else, or if it is working, do we continue this for the long term? That's an open question right now. And we've gotten feedback on both sides on longer or shorter for each of these. We don't know the impact of the therapies on fatigue and other measures of quality of life. And of course, these are really important to patients. There's some controversy about the impact of these therapies on non-white populations. The evidence, I guess, in the report shows that it looks like the non-white population do at least as well and maybe even better with these therapies compared to standard of care, though the studies were, the subgroups were too small to say anything definitive. And then finally, the word on the street is that voclosporin has less toxicity than the other calcineurin inhibitors, but we have very little clinical experience with it, and we really need more information. So one of the many areas of uncertainty that play into the challenges in assessing the long-term benefits of the therapy. Next slide, please. Potential other benefits and contextual considerations. Lupus affects young adults, as I've highlighted throughout, and is the major cause of premature mortality for patients living with lupus nephritis, living with lupus. So really important above and beyond just the cost data. This is a life-altering disease. Voclosporin is an oral drug, which is an improvement. Belimumab is an IV therapy, at least as studied for lupus nephritis. Lupus nephritis disproportionately impacts non-white patients. And as I already alluded, subgroup analyses suggest that both Belimumab and Voclosporin may be more effective in Black patients, but really we need larger studies to definitively document that. And then finally, Belimumab is indicated for lupus in general, and so it may have other benefits in patients beyond its impact on renal function, so something to consider when assessing the value of Belimumab. Next slide, please. We received a number of public comments. Most important ones that I wanted to highlight here were that a higher proportion of patients in the Belimumab trial achieved low lupus disease activity. So this is beyond the renal activity. This is looking at a standard score measuring the activity of lupus. Less than 4 is considered low disease activity, and 28% of patients in the BLISS-LN trial who received Belimumab achieved low lupus disease activity versus 19% in the placebo group. Belimumab is available in a subcutaneous formulation. That's the way it's mostly used now for the treatment of lupus itself. but this hasn't been studied in lupus nephritis. However, over time, we may find that the subcutaneous formulation, which would be easier for patients, may supplant the IV formulation. And finally, as I already highlighted, voclosporin does carry this black box warning. Next slide, please. So in summary, I didn't present all of the outcome data. It's in the report and in the tables, but most people have read the report. Belimumab significantly increases the complete renal response and their primary outcome at 2 years compared with standard therapy alone without increases in adverse events. However, 2 years we feel is too short to provide high certainty of the magnitude or duration of the clinical benefit. So a modest clinical benefit, clear improvements, but uncertainty about the long-term benefits. Voclosporin, very similar. It increases the complete response and partial response at 1 year compared to standard therapy without increases in adverse events. But again, uncertainty about the magnitude and duration of the long-term benefits. Next slide, please. So putting all that together, the evidence rating that we gave both therapies is a B+. So moderate certainty that the intervention is incremental or better than the comparator. So both of these improved significantly, and I think most people would consider it an important improvement in absolute benefit. But again, uncertainty about the long-term net benefits. And so given that uncertainty, we gave it a B+, which as Dr. Pearson likes to highlight is actually our second highest rating. The only rating that we can give that's higher is A, which would be high certainty of a substantial net health benefit. And we don't feel like the data are there yet for either of these therapies. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm happy to take questions if we have time.
Thank you, Dr. Tyson. I just wanted to thank you and congratulate you and the rest of the ICER research team on a tremendously informative and rigorous report. I think we started a few minutes late, so we are a bit pinched for time, but maybe if I could just ask very quickly. So you've obviously referenced the black box warning for voclosporin, and sort of with any immunomodulatory agents, there are very real risks of longer term sort of safety endpoints that could never be detected in a trial. And so you've outlined very nicely that there's a lot of uncertainties in that area, but is there anything that we should consider in our deliberations in terms of information about mechanism or perhaps in vitro data that could, I know this isn't the typical standard of evidence that we use, but could potentially inform how we might speculate and deliberate about that?
It looks like Dr. Ravin unmuted himself, so he's one of the clinical experts, and he may want to jump in on this. Dr. Ravin?
Thanks. I didn't know. I assumed I could speak a little bit. So I had a couple things I wrote down during your very excellent summary of everything, really, in such a short period of time. One thing that I think we have to be aware of, and I don't know that it's really that common knowledge, even amongst patients, is that lupus itself for young women is a independent cardiovascular risk factor with premature cardiovascular disease. And as many of you know, the physicians know, chronic kidney disease, not just end-stage kidney disease, is also a non-traditional independent risk factor for cardiovascular outcomes. And so I think that even though we sort of track end-stage kidney disease and it's improved over many years, we still don't really know or have a good handle of how many patients with lupus nephritis are prevalent chronic kidney disease. And I think that is something we should think about. Preventing ongoing or progressive chronic kidney disease, even if it doesn't reach end-stage kidney disease, is really important, because I think that we then have a chance of decreasing early cardiovascular morbidity. So that's one thing. To answer your question a little bit, Jason, there are data. I'm happy to say they've been submitted to a major journal looking at Belimumab and its effects on not simply remission rate, which was the PERR was the primary outcome, but also the preservation of kidney function. And I realize it's only 2 years, but the decline in GFR, this is how we measure kidney function, was greater in the placebo group than the patients in the treated arm with the Belimumab. The other thing that I think is really important is, as you indicated, what we really want is patients to stay off a need for dialysis or transplantation in the future. And one of the things that we do know is that every time a patient has a flare of lupus nephritis, chronic damage does accumulate in the kidney, and you have enough chronic damage, then you progress whether or not the disease is active anyway. And so something important to keep in mind is that the addition of Belimumab actually showed a markedly decreased flare rate in patients both with renal disease and without renal disease, the older Belimumab trials in the non-renal lupus population. So I think those are two important things to consider going forward. And then one last thing, I know I don't want to take everyone's time. Voclosporin is something that nephrologists are used to quite a bit because we've used it for decades in the transplant community. But Voclosporin, in addition to being a T-cell drug, which is really important contributor to, kidney lupus nephritis pathogenesis, Voclosporin actually also affects the kidney podocyte. The kidney podocyte are these little cells that sit on top of the glomeruli, the filtering units of the kidney. And if you lose a sufficient number of podocytes, you're going to progress to end-stage kidney disease no matter what happens to your underlying disease. And so stabilization of podocyte function is another unique aspect of Voclosporin. So each drug has additional things beyond simply the endpoint of that clinical trial, of those clinical trials. I'll be quiet now.
No, that was very helpful. Thank you. Are there any other questions from the CEPAC? I know this is a little bit hypocritical because I took the first question, but we are a little behind time. But I would just ask if there are any other questions from the CEPAC before we move on to the economic modeling presentation. Okay, thank you so much. I guess next I would welcome Dr. Lena Mandrick for the presentation of the evidence in economic modeling.
Hello everyone, my name is Lena Mandrick. I'm a research fellow at the University of Sheffield, and I will present effectiveness and value for Belimumab and Voclosporin for patients with lupus nephritis. Next slide, please. The key modeling team members are James and Praveen. We have no conflict of interest to disclose, but we acknowledge the financial support provided to the University of Sheffield from the Institute for Clinical and Economic Review. Next slide, please. The objective of our work was to estimate cost effectiveness of Belimumab and Voclosporin for patients with lupus nephritis. Each of these drugs was compared to the standard care as represented by the comparator arm in their own pivotal trials, meaning that Belimumab was compared to cyclophosphamide and MMF as a standard therapy, and Voclosporin was compared to MMF treatment only. Next slide, please. I will go through the methods in brief. Next slide, please. We designed a new model, and this new model, it consisted of two parts. The first part was short-term trial-based Markov model, and it was informed by the trials for both drugs, for Voclosporin and Belimumab. We did not have long-term data for patient survival on Voclosporin and Belimumab because both trials, they were only short-term. One was 1 year and another one was 2 years for Belimumab. But in both trials, in trials for both drugs, patients in the end of the trial follow-up, they were reported in the which health states they appear. So the trials reported whether how many patients appeared in the active disease state, complete response, or partial response state. And we needed to understand how the disease progressed and how patients survive through their lifetime. And for this, we also used a long-term model based on partition survival modeling. So the long-term model used outputs from the short-term model as inputs to understand what is the disease progression and survival for patients remaining in active disease, complete response, and partial response states as it is reported in a trial. The setting we used is United States setting with healthcare sector perspective. We used lifetime horizon, cost and outcomes were discounted as 3%, per year. The cycle length was 1 month, and we used 3 primary outcomes: cost per quality adjusted life years gained, cost per life years gained, and cost per equal value of life years gained. Next slide, please. We target to model population as similar to population of patients with lupus nephritis in the US as possible. And that was one of the main criteria for us to select the long-term data, the data for the long-term model. And the population in this study, in the data that we use, had mean age of 36 years with 92% of females and 53% of Black population. The short-term model had a duration of 3 years, and the long-term model was over a lifetime of the patients. And next slide, please. In the short-term model, all patients started in active disease state, and they remained in this state unless they progressed to one of the 4 other health states, which are partial response, complete response, end-stage renal disease, or death. And we considered that if patients progress to one of these other health states, they will remain in this health state up to the end of the short-term model. So up to 3 years. Next slide, please. The key assumptions in the short-term model were the following. Patients in complete and partial response state, they discontinued treatment in the end of the short-term model, so in 3 years, unless serious adverse event leading to treatment discontinuation occurs. That was a time at midpoint of the short-term model, which is 18 months. Patients in active disease state, we consider they discontinued treatment at 18 months. Informed by patients, we also considered impact of lower dose steroid use on decrease in costs and increase in quality of life in the short-term model. Next slide, please. The key clinical input to the short-term model for Belimumab were informed by BLISS-LN trial. For complete response, we used response over time for each month. For the other outcomes, such as partial renal response, end-stage renal disease, and death, we used efficacy at 104 weeks, so at the trial endpoint. Next slide, please. For Voclosporin, the key clinical modeling input were informed by 2 trials synthesized in meta-analysis by AURORA and AURA-LV. So these outputs included complete renal response, partial renal response, end-stage renal disease, and death with efficacy at 52 weeks. So for complete response and partial response, we used results from meta-analysis. But for other outcomes, such as death, they were informed by AURORA trial only. Next slide, please. So in the short-term model, in the end of the model, there were groups of patients who appeared in different health states. They appeared in active disease, in a complete response, or in a partial response, ESRD, or death. And the disease progression in the long term was different for patients depending on which state they appeared. So what we did is we fit the different survival curves to Kaplan-Meier data, and we estimated the time to end-stage renal disease for patients who remained in the end of the short-term model in different health states. You can see on the slide, the red curve is for the patients who remained in the end of the short-term model in active disease, and the mean time to ESRD for these patients was 13 years. The green curve represents the time to ESRD for those patients who appeared in the end of the short-term model in complete and partial response, and the mean time to ESRD was 19.4 years. So we can see that for those patients who remained in complete and partial response, the mean time to ESRD was longer than for those patients who appeared in active disease state in the end of the short-term model. You can also see that here we have one curve for complete and partial response, And this was because in the data that we used to inform long-term modeling, the curves for complete and partial response, they were crossing over. So we combined this data to ensure clinical plausibility. Next slide, please. So we used proportion between end-stage renal disease and death to estimate overall survival for patients remaining in active disease and remaining in complete or partial response in the end of the short-term model. And again, you can see on the slide, red curve is for those patients who remained in active disease, and the mean overall survival for those patients was 23.7 years, and the green curve is for patients who remained in complete and partial response in the end of the short-term model, and mean overall survival for those patients was 28.1 years. So again, on overall, patients who remained in complete and renal response in the end of short-term model, they lived longer than those patients who remained in active disease. Next slide, please. The key assumptions of the long-term model included the following. Patients in active disease, complete and partial response at the end of the short-term model, they transition to the long-term model independently on the previous treatment received. This means that independently whether a patient was receiving Belimumab treatment, Voclosporin treatment, or standard care, the only thing that determined their progression in the long-term model was in which stage they appear in the end of the short-term model. So whether they were in active disease, complete, partial response, or ESRD. We also considered that patients in complete and partial response, they have the same overall and ESRD survival. As I explained before, this was informed by the data used in the modeling. Another assumption that we used was related to the structure of partition survival modeling. You saw that there are only two curves for each disease state, so it's ESRD-free and overall survival. Informed by clinical experts, we also considered that those patients who are in the response state, before they progress to ESRD, they spend certain time in active disease state, and we used 1.2 years informed by SLEEK data as an estimate for this time that patients spent in active disease state before progressing to ESRD. Next slide, please. The treatment-related cost for Belimumab, it's included loading dose, meaning 3 injections during the first months of treatment, which resulted to the monthly cost of $9,800. The further cost for Belimumab included $3,560, and these costs were calculated as 1 injection during 28 days, as it was reported in BLISS-LN trial. And the estimate was based on average sales price, IV dose, as it's also used in BLISS-LN trial, and distribution of weights for patients in the US, as it is reported in the literature. For Voclosporin, the calculation of the monthly costs were based on mean weighted daily dose, price per word, and assumed discount of 22.5%. Next slide, please. Because both drugs are added on the top of the standard treatment, the standard therapy was not added additionally to the annual health-related costs because we considered that this is already reflected in these costs. We used a number of sources combined to calculate the cost in complete response, partial response, and active disease state. But for end-stage renal disease, we used data from Medicare provided by Lupus Research Alliance, since patients in end-stage renal disease, they are qualified to be covered by Medicare. In the scenario analysis, we also conducted assessment using societal perspective. And in this case, we also used indirect besides direct costs. And this is the right column that you can see on this slide. And these indirect costs, they include cost of absenteeism, so cost of missing days of work, cost of unemployment, and cost of caregivers. Next slide, please. We relied on the best available sources to calculate quality of life values. You can see the values reported on this slide. Additionally, we also considered increment in quality of life for those patients who remain on low-dose steroids and those patients who are treated without steroids. Next slide, please. I will present the results for both treatments. For Belimumab, the drug costs were $93,500, and you can see that it takes around 10% of the total costs. But Belimumab treatment also resulted to increase in quality-adjusted life years, or equal value of life years gained compared to the standard care. This, in the end, resulted to incremental cost-effectiveness ratio of 89,700 per quality-adjusted life year. Next slide, please. We also conducted one-way sensitivity analysis. The main uncertainty was around costs of active disease health states and utility in complete response health state. But in general, the results of one-way sensitivity analysis show high certainty in cost effectiveness of Belimumab treatment. Next slide, please. For Voclosporin, the drug costs were $215,000. And it approximately takes 23% of the total costs. But Voclosporin, also similar to Belimumab, resulted to increase in quality-adjusted life years, and equal values of life years gained, comparing to the standard care. The incremental cost-effectiveness ratio for Voclosporin was $149,000 per quality-adjusted life year. Next slide, please. In one-way sensitivity analysis, the most influential parameters were monthly cost for active disease health state and utility in active disease health state. But for Voclosporin, we can see a quite high uncertainty regarding cost effectiveness of the drug if we look on the results of one-way sensitivity analysis. Next slide, please. As all models should do, to explore further uncertainty, we conducted probabilistic sensitivity analysis. And what you can see on this slide is probability to be cost-effective for each drug with different threshold. So, for example, with a threshold of 100,000 per quality, Belimumab is 52%, has probability to be cost-effective, while Voclosporin 11%, and with a threshold of 150,000 per quality, Belimumab has this probability as 69% and Voclosporin 49%. Next slide, please. We conducted number of scenario analysis, and the second column for comparison, you can see the base case results. As in general, looking on the different scenario analysis, we can see that our base case is a quite optimistic case that we selected. With societal perspective, expectedly, we can see that incremental cost effectiveness ratio decrease. It is 66,000 per quality for Belimumab and 132,000 per quality for Voclosporin. Informed by data, because the longitudinal data we select to predict long-term survival of patients and long-term progression was very optimistic in comparison to the alternative data sources. We did the scenario assuming lower survival in response state, and in this case, incremental cost-effectiveness ratio increased for both drugs, and it was 170,000 for Belimumab and 237,000 for Voclosporin. Depending on suggestions of the patients, we also considered possibility of lower utility values in response state. And again, in this case, the incremental cost effectiveness ratio increased for both drugs, and it was 115,000 for Belimumab and 186,000 for Voclosporin. In the long-term model, we considered that patients spend certain time in active disease state if they are in response state before they progress to SRD. And we used SLEEK data, which reported 1.2 years for this value. We conducted another scenario analysis, assuming increased time that patients spent in active disease state. Here we used 3 years, and in this case, again, incremental cost effectiveness ratio increased for both drugs. Next slide, please. Another scenario that we conducted for voclosporin was based on drug labeling. We assumed treatment discontinuation not at 18 months, but at 6 months for those patients who remain in active disease state in a short-term model. And in this case, expectedly, incremental cost effectiveness ratio decreased, and it was equal to 122,000 per QALY. We also considered alternative source to assess cost in health state. This calculation, which is presented in the last column on the slide in the table, they were based on cost ratios between end-stage renal disease, which used in the base case analysis, and other health states. These are data in confidence. And again, in this case, incremental cost effectiveness ratio increased for both voclosporin and Belimumab. Next slide, please. Our model has certain limitations. In particular, these limitations are related to limitations of the data used in the model. For instance, there was a lack of high quality data on racial and ethnic subgroups. There was a high uncertainty around long-term disease progression, even though we targeted to use the best, the most recent source with high representation to the lupus nephritis population in the US. As I mentioned, with the data that we used were quite optimistic in comparison to alternative sources. And if other source would be used, that would result to drugs being less cost effective. There is another uncertainty around duration of active disease state in the long-term model. And again, if a higher value was selected, the drugs would be less cost effective. And in the end, there is another uncertainty related to duration of therapy and long-term clinical effects of the therapies, as it was presented also in clinical section. And in this case, the cost effectiveness estimates could change one way or another way. Next slide, please. We received a number of comments on our draft report. In particular, one group of comment was related to differential treatment durations for respondents and not respondents. We get suggestion that treatment in the response state may be either shorter or longer than 3 years. In the current version of our analysis, we used treatment duration at 3 years, but the duration of treatment in active disease state was decreased to 18 months. The second group of the comments was related to cost of end-stage renal disease. The suggestions were that the costs we used previously were too low, so we substituted this cost to cost of end-stage renal disease sourced from Medicare covered patients. Next slide, please. So our conclusions are the following. Incremental cost effectiveness ratio for Belimumab is 89,700 per QALY. Incremental cost effectiveness ratio for voclosporin is 149,000 per QALY, and there is a large uncertainty in cost effectiveness of voclosporin than in cost effectiveness of Belimumab. Next slide, please. I welcome your questions.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mandrick, for your wonderful presentation and rigorous work by you and the whole health economics and decision analytic team. At this, we're running slightly late, but I think we can shift things about 10 minutes. So we would welcome any questions from the CEPAC or also from the patient experts. We would welcome any questions about the presentations. Megan, I think I see you. Yeah, thank you.
My hand as
yeah,
I'm
thank
doing
you.
it physically. Thank you very much. Very helpful. And this is maybe a broader question, but do we know anything from the clinical trials or other research about who responds and why some people respond and some don't?
Jeff. Sounds like more a clinical question, so one for me. To date, there are no biomarkers that I'm aware of that identify, who's more likely to respond to Belimumab or Voclosporin. So certainly an area of active research. There's a lot written about that, but to date, nothing unless the clinical experts have something new to add. That's my understanding.
This is Megan. I think one of the main concerns really is effectiveness of Belimumab in the Black population. And that's pretty well documented. There was a whole clinical trial, the Embrace trial, that failed. I think they enrolled 400 something African-American patients in non-renal lupus, and they failed to demonstrate efficacy of Belimumab over placebo in that population. And this clinical trial, both of them enrolled very, very few patients of African descent. I think it was 13% in Belimumab and 8% in Voclosporin. So I really think this is a very important point, given that so many of our lupus patients are of Black ancestry.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Steve Kogut, I think I see your hand up.
Terrific, thanks. It was a great presentation, helped clarify for me some issues in the report. So thanks for your excellent work and your team overall. My question is about the ICER for Voclosporin in the base case. It's right at the threshold for our willingness to pay at 150K per quality. And the credible range that's presented for that, I'm concerned that it might be interpreted as maybe a confidence interval or some measure of variability by stakeholders. But yet, if you look at the cost effectiveness acceptability curve, it's really steep within that area between 100,000 and 200,000 per quality. In fact, half of the model runs were beyond 150K per quality. So just ask if maybe you could clarify how that credible range was defined and how we might consider that, given that the CEA curve indicates, really just hard to pin down what the actual ICER would be for in the base case.
So you're referring to the cost effectiveness acceptability curve in the supplementary material that we reported.
Figure E9.
Yes. So in the probabilistic sensitivity analysis, all parameters, they varied simultaneously, right? So for both drugs, the probability to reach cost effectiveness is different because there is a different uncertainty regarding clinical data that included in probabilistic sensitivity analysis. And that's why you can see that while the cost inputs, the inputs were the same, the clinical data were different. And that's why the acceptability curves, they look differently for both treatments.
If I could follow up, just, the concern is that the credible range that's presented for the ICER value for Voclosporin seems to be pretty tight. And when I look at figure E9, the CEA curve for Voclosporin, it suggests there's a lot more variability there. So just wondering how that credible range was determined. I didn't see that detail in the report. Maybe I missed it.
The credibility range, you mean the probability to be cost effective in the table?
I think it was in the supplementary material, it was a 95% confidence intervals, which includes jackknifing and bootstrapping. So yeah, so it includes the bootstrapped 95% intervals after jackknifing.
Do you want to comment on this?
Yeah. No, I think, yeah. So basically we run 1,000 runs of the PSA, and to obviously we can't average all the incremental cost effectiveness ratios. So we use the runs, and then we bootstrapped and then jackknifed. We can provide more details of that later on if you want.
Okay, so there are different approaches between the CEA and the table E18, and I don't mean to get us into the weeds. I'm just suggesting that our reporting of a credible range that's so tight around that 150 cost per quality may lead us to think that although we're really at the limit of our willingness to pay, we have some certainty that that's what the value is. And I'm suggesting that the PSA might lead us to conclude otherwise.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you, Steve, for this was a point that I was kind of thinking about too. So thank you. This is just because it's so close to the line. Other questions, including from the patient experts, we would love, I guess even with the 10 extra minutes, we only have 1 more minute, but maybe we could take 1 more question. I see a question from Dr. Conti.
Hi again, thank you. So I want to push a little bit harder on the question regarding the representativeness of the trials to meet the general population. The trials look very non-representative, and particularly in patient populations that are clearly vulnerable and stand to benefit from enhanced treatment. So I would like to understand a little bit more about the trial design, but also how the clinicians plan to use the trial data in the real world population, given the significant mismatch. Thank you.
This is Steve. Let me just jump in that last part I'd like to bring up on the policy roundtable. It's a great question. I think we can talk about the evidence now and then address that as we talk about its application to clinical practice. But maybe Jeff or others can just, if there is any other context to give to how unrepresentative in a way the trials were of the American patient population. Anything else?
I think it's predominantly because I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. I could look them up, but about maybe 30% were in North America, and there were a large number of Asian centers. Now, Asians also have severe lupus nephritis, so it's an important subgroup, but not as representative of lupus in the U.S. as you saw from Lena's model. The assumption was, I think, 54% were Black, as being more representative of the U.S. population. And so, I mean, it's really a reflection of this was an international clinical trial with only a minority of clinical sites in the U.S. I will say for both, when you look at subgroup analyses with Blacks, they did not statistically significant, but the point estimates were actually better for Blacks. The odds ratio for the primary outcome, the PERR, and for the complete renal response for Belimumab. Similarly, for Voclosporin, Blacks had a higher probability of complete response. Again, not significantly different because of the small n's, but at least the movement was in the right direction, predominantly driven by they actually did worse with standard therapy than the white populations, and so they got a bigger benefit with these new therapies.
Thank you.